Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. China and the U.S. will hold a top-level diplomatic and security dialogue in Washington on Friday after repeated delays. Chinese Communist Party's Office of Foreign Affairs Director Yang Jiechi and Defense Minister Wei Fenghe will lead the Chinese delegation, while U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Secretary of Defense James Mattis will represent Washington. While the primary focus will be on diplomatic and security ties, discussions on restoring bilateral trade relations also expected. Before we start our discussion, take a look.
The dialogue was originally planned to take place in Beijing in October, but was postponed several times at Washington's request. Recently, there were signs of a pause in strained relations between China and the U.S. In a recent meeting with former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Chinese President Xi Jinping remained optimistic when he talked about rekindling ties.
The China-U.S. relationship has experienced turbulence and difficulties, but it has kept moving forward in the right direction.
Meanwhile, in his first media conference since the midterm elections, U.S. President Donald Trump said he wished to improve relations with China.
President Xi and I have agreed to meet at the G20. We'll be having dinner. We'll be discussing it. But I think a very good deal will be made with China.
On November 1st, President Xi and Mr. Trump had a telephone conversation. After the exchange, the U.S. President tweeted he had a long and very good conversation with President Xi, and that discussions on trade are moving along nicely. As the U.S. midterms wrapped up, Republicans kept a majority in the Senate, and the Democrats took control of the House. What it means for the future of relations with China is uncertain, but both sides have shown some goodwill. They did appear to seek a middle ground at the upcoming G20 summit later this month.
For more on the U.S.-China diplomatic security dialogue, we are joined in Beijing studio Zhang Junshe, senior captain who is the vice president of China's Naval Research Institute. Also in our Beijing studio, Zhao Tong, an associate at Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. In Boston, in the U.S., we have Robert Ross, a professor of political science at Boston College and associate at Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies in Harvard University. And in Baltimore, we are joined by Robert Daly, director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S. at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to have the four of you being with us, a very strong panel. Let's tap into your wisdom. Professor Ross, if you hear the adjectives used by both sides about what kind of strategic and security dialogue this should be, do you think the two sides are really thinking about the same thing and the same end goal, at least for this specific dialogue?
My fear is that both sides are still in the stage of posturing. The United States wants to show its resolve to continue in this trade conflict if necessary to achieve its ends, and the United States wants to posture in the South China Sea to show its resolve to resist the rise of China. And the Chinese want to show their resolve that they will not succumb to trade pressures, and they will continue to defend their security interests and resist American pressures in the South China Sea. So these two issues, economics and military issues, have yet to be resolved. They continue to aggravate the relationship, and I haven't seen from either side a willingness to make concessions that could make the relationship better.
Let's also feel the temperature coming from Mr. Daly. Mr. Kissinger, with which your institute is named after, met with Chinese President Xi and also some of the top Chinese officials. So maybe you can help us to understand as well, what do you think the end game and the end goal, at least for this dialogue, are they similar to one another?
Well, I would agree with Professor Ross that this is still primarily about posturing, and the difficulties that both sides face are both deep and broad. So a half-day get-together really isn't going to solve those. But I think that it's good that the dialogue is happening in Washington today, and maybe the two sides can begin to feel around for where the floor is on this relationship, which continues to be rapidly deteriorating. Right now we're in a downward spiral. It's not yet a free fall, and neither side seems to know where the red lines may be or where the floor may be. So perhaps this dialogue can help us get an initial sense of that, but I wouldn't look for a real resolution of any issues.
Posturing, what the floor is, where the red line is, those have been the assessment of possibly the goal of this dialogue from our American guests. What about from you, Mr. Zhao Tong? From the Chinese side, is it about the bottom line or is it about the principle?
Well, I kind of disagree with our American speaker who said both sides are posturing. I think both sides have a real interest in managing the bilateral relationship.
It depends on who you are talking to.
I think both countries understand that this relationship is at a critical juncture. In fact, I was in D.C. The week before last week, and the overall atmosphere was very different. The American officials even didn't want to exchange their name cards with me, fearing that letting a Chinese scholar know their email address is a serious security concern for them. They really are starting to put China in a category that is similar to former Soviet Union and today's Russia. So it's another way to say we are at a juncture where the bilateral relationship can escalate into a new Cold War or become a less competitive one in the future. So both countries want to avoid the worst case scenario, wants to make sure they can shift the direction to a more positive one.
Senior Captain Zhang, is this going to be a checking out by both sides about what each other's bottom line is and a possibility of working out the red line before we are heading to a Cold War? Or this is actually going to be the very beginning of the melting of the ice, even though the ice have been built just within a very short period of time?
Well, I think the resumption of all the second round of the diplomatic and security dialogue between the two sides now can begin. I think this fully demonstrates the common will and desire of both sides to manage and control the differences between the two sides. And we want to avoid possible conflict in the future. I think this is a positive sign for both sides and for the world. But we know that it is more difficult this round of diplomatic and security dialogue than the last year, because we are facing more and more strategic worries from the U.S. side. So I think this is a good occasion for China to explain what we are thinking about the possible the future.
About the South China Sea, for example, sir, since you are coming from the Navy side, is there anything that the Chinese side, as you would see it, would be able to explain that the U.S. side have not heard, and also the U.S. side could show sympathy about, and the Chinese side and the U.S. side could see more, in a way, the common ground in understanding the real situation over there?
Yes, I think we want to explain what it is really happening in the South China Sea. The United States side has made, I think, a wrong judgment about China's, or wrong assessment about China's ambition, the so-called ambition in this area.
Wrong assessment. We want to explain better understanding. That's some of the key words the two Chinese guests want to use in their anticipation of this dialogue. Mr. Daly, it's very clear that what the Chinese said to the U.S. side, particularly during Dr. Kissinger's visit to China this time, the Chinese president used several phrases in order to describe what he considered as the right way of doing U.S.-China relations. Non-confrontational, conflict-free. It needs to be cooperation and mutual respect. These are the phrases. As you may know, the Chinese side, when it comes to bilateral relations, usually put the principles first. And even though these words could be abstract, but it does demonstrate what the Chinese side want and desire in a relationship. Mr. Daly, what's your understanding of these phrases? Do you think Washington today, particularly today's White House, will be able to understand?
Well, these phrases, as you mentioned, they're fairly vague, and they've also been around for a long time. We've heard about, non-confrontation during the period in which China was pushing for a new model of major power relations. And to Americans, these phrases really don't suggest any clear content or direction. It is very easy to say that peace is better than war and cooperation is better than competition. This is easily said. It's not terribly helpful, and I think what would be helpful would be if we put international law into the mix and had specific discussions about codes of conduct that could help us to avoid potential collision or misunderstanding. So I think that while, yes, peace is better than war, we really need to look at the International Convention on the Law of the Sea, the findings of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and then to talk seriously about codes of conduct and channels of communication that can prevent accidents. So as you implied, the Chinese side tends to start with these sort of vague proposals. America isn't simply going to sign on to those and say, yes, everything is okay now. It is time for specifics.
However, I have to say the Americans also give some adjectives. For example, the U.S. ambassador to China, when he was speaking at the State Department on Thursday, did give several adjectives as well. Constructive, result-oriented. Of course, result, it depends on whether both sides are happy about the result or not. That's another question. Professor Ross, your input here. With these adjectives, will the two sides be able to find some common ground? Earlier, Mr. Daly suggested, well, maybe some concrete details. But as you may know, these kinds of dialogue are at a pretty high level. Finding details, you have to work it out through different levels of the bureaucrats in order to reach something and to even have the state leaders to sign on to it. So, Professor Ross, what do you think? Will this dialogue be able to help us have better interpretation of these adjectives coming from both sides?
Well, I would agree that both sides want peace and cooperation and non-confrontational relationship. But at the same time, they also want to achieve their individual national interest objectives, and those haven't changed. So I tend to see the relationship as fundamentally based upon serious conflicts of interest, whether it's the strategic order in the South China Sea and East Asia, whether it's the trade relationship. And the question is not, can we do away with these conflicts of interest? The question is not whether we can ignore them. The question is how we deal with them, whether it's at a high level of confrontation, whether it's quiet diplomacy. And in the past 2 years now, it's been fairly high-level diplomacy with confrontational rhetoric. And I think both sides might do better if we could level it down a bit, tone it down, have some quiet diplomacy, so that we don't contribute to escalated conflict simply by rhetoric. And we can manage the relationship at sea or manage the relationship in trade through quiet negotiations that would be far more constructive than shouting across the Pacific Ocean.
Right. But Professor Ross, just very quickly a follow-up, as you may know, nothing now can be quiet with the rhetorics already building to this stage. And scholars like you, who have been, maybe even believed by some in the United States as panda huggers, are already talking quite harsh in a way from the Chinese perspective. So you can see how far we have gone just within a very short period of time, which is hurting a lot of people. By the way, it has been 40 years, Mr. Daly, China-U.S. relations at the very beginning of next year. It's 40th anniversary, and it took generations of Chinese and Americans with a lot of wisdom in order to let us reach where we are, including Dr. Henry Kissinger, including many of the diplomatic and security forerunners. So, Mr. Daly, do you think that kind of legacy will still matter to the two countries? If the other areas, for example, political, defense, security, trade and economic ties, are very hard to work out a commonly agreed upon solutions for now, but will legacy be able to hold us to a certain extent?
Very important question. I wish that we were asking that more here in the United States. I think that we are in for, as Hank Paulson said in Singapore earlier this week, a potential long winter in U.S.-China relations. But I think the legacy of engagement is still extremely important, and that an informed engagement, not a naive engagement, needs to remain a pillar of this relationship going forward. It's not just a relationship between the top leaders in Washington and Beijing. It involves subnational governments, universities, professional associations that have been very successful in solving problems together, advancing knowledge together, and that, I think, can and must continue. It is getting harder, and the consensus for engagement in Washington as the keynote of U.S.-China relations, I think, is gone. As the keynote, it's gone. But it can remain a major strand, and I think that, yes, the ties that have been forged over the previous 40 years can continue to play a positive role, but I don't think they can play a determinative role if we don't get the trade issues, the security issues, the global order issues right.
Right. Kissinger, Dr. Kissinger, during his stay in Beijing, he talked to President Xi, and here's an exact quote. "I believe," he said, "the cooperation between China and the United States is essential for peace and progress in the world, and I see the enormous contribution you have made to these efforts." That's a quote coming from Dr. Kissinger to the Chinese side. Having said that, though, Dr. Kissinger is a legendary figure. He's not at all in the current administration in Washington, and therefore he is coming from a historic perspective. Mr. Zhao, though, there are a lot of pragmatic issues, as the other guests have clearly illustrated, that need to be worked out, and worked out as efficiently as possible. Mr. Zhao.
Yes, I respectfully disagree with our American speaker who said the two countries' interests are fundamentally confrontational. I think that's the wrong conclusion drawn about the current relationship. I think some of the disagreement is really a result of lack of genuine understanding about each other's thinking and philosophy. In fact, I just heard some senior American experts who attended the first U.S.-China security and diplomatic dialogue, and they complained after attending that meeting that basically the discussion was a superficial exchange of talking points. It was not substantive. And therefore, they concluded that China was not sincere. China wants to hide its real intention. But in fact, I think that's the Chinese way of having a communication. China wants to put principles first, right? We need to set principles first before we can have substantive operational level discussion. That's a different philosophy.
Okay.
I think the solution is we do have real areas of common interest. We can cooperate in Africa. We all want those regions to develop, become richer. We can still cooperate in non-proliferation areas. We don't want to see nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction to further spread to additional countries. We all want to counter terrorism. The thing is, we don't really understand how each other's approach differs. And we need to develop a more empathetic attitude toward each other's thinking and try to identify the real source of disagreements.
But the question is, do you think both sides have the patience for now? That is the question, with all the rhetorics being built up in each capitals and also in different parts of each countries. That's an interesting question. Let me go to you, Professor Ross, about some specifics. If we talk about specifics, for example, the U.S. withdrawal from intermediate range nuclear treaty, that's one. And the other thing, of course, is the DPRK issue, that both sides have a common interest not to mutually destruct one another. And it also has, as both sides many times said, a common interest of keeping peace and stability in the Northeast Asia. So if those are common grounds already clearly clarified, do you think there can be movements toward some kinds of common plan to work together?
Well, these are complicated issues. First, I think America understands...
These are complicated issues. These are complicated issues. You said yourself, sir, you cannot work it out just through one dialogue, a dialogue of half a day through the top level officials. So if we miss this opportunity, sir, what are we going to do?
Thank you.
Professor Ross.
Well,
I'm just trying to be provocative here.
First of all, the Chinese have been saying the Chinese leadership has been saying for many years that they object to America's Cold War alliances. Well, of course, the American alliance system in East Asia is the foundation of our security policy. So China's made it clear that it wants to erode the foundation of America's security policy. On the other hand, the United States has made it clear to China that it objects to the rise of the Chinese Navy and becoming an equal force in the South China Sea. The United States has made clear that it wants to maintain dominance in the South China Sea. These are fundamental conflicts of interest that are not easily resolved. In that context, however, I would also agree that maintaining engagement is critical. So we've seen some American universities protest recent Chinese policies by pulling out of China. I would hope that that would not become a trend. Intellectual exchanges are critical to maintaining a foundation of dialogue, of cooperation across a wide variety of areas, even as we have conflict elsewhere. Now, you mentioned the intermediate-range ballistic missile issue. Of course, this is a concern because these missiles that China is building are targeting American capabilities in East Asia. And so America has their concerns, and it's not clear what China's objectives are, for example, in having a missile that can reach Guam.
Right.
And so America's naturally concerned. On the Korean Peninsula, we have differences. The Chinese are clearly supporting South Korea's efforts to improve relations with North Korea, where America seems to be less supportive, more resistant to the pace of change between South Korea and North Korea. Now, we all have an interest in denuclearization. However, I also feel that this is it's a little too late for that now. And now America, South Korea, China needs to deal with the reality that North Korea is a nuclear power, and America seems to be lagging in this respect.
Right. Very quickly respond before we go to Senior Captain Zhang. Right.
Well, on the issue of INF Treaty intermediate-range missiles, China developed such missiles in order to deter American military intervention near China's coast.
Okay.
And the U.S. wants to develop similar capabilities because the fields its forward-based military assets in this region are increasingly threatened. So both countries are, in fact, defense-oriented. They're not driven by offensive expansionist intentions. So if the U.S. withdraws and then deploys such missiles, China will for sure respond by developing even more and deploying even more such missiles. The result is a very expensive arms race.
Okay.
So I think the key is to answer your question. We have to have this patience to clarify our intentions in order to avoid the dire consequences.
And therefore, there has to be intention from both sides to understand and also go deeper so that what other side said can be further thought about by one party, and therefore trust can be built. Having said that, though, Senior Captain Zhang, I need to let you respond as well very quickly from your side. Can the military be a confidence builder, or rather the other way around?
I think the military can be a confident building partner during the dialogue. But I think, to be frank, that this round of friction between China and the United States are mainly caused by the U.S. Misunderstanding of China's policy, China's strategy.
Okay, let me go to you, Mr. Daly. We are already having finger pointing going on among all of you. So let me go to you about that. Chinese President Xi Jinping, this time meeting with Dr. Kissinger, also mentioned about the negative thinking and negative talk inside U.S. about China recent months, and he said it has to be paid attention to. Sir, what do you make of these kinds of ambience about one another in terms of relations? And what would that mean for policymakers? I mean, real policymakers, not those shouting out at TVs every day, not our program, of course.
Well, first I would point out that the negative comments are mutual. There is as much of this in Beijing as in Washington, but in America it tends to be much more in the public sphere because of a very different culture. And then, of course, we have a president who is particularly direct. That's probably a fairly safe way to put it. But yes, we hear that the rhetoric from the American side is strong, but the negativity is equally strong on the Chinese side. And I think that there is something to the American position, the Trump administration position, that a lot of what it's doing is reactive, is catching up to broad strategic decisions that were made in China years ago. China's diplomatic rhetoric, public rhetoric, is much more moderated, more polite. But I think that it's mutual and that it's important to recognize this. This is not something that America has done to China. This is a long-term, historical, structural series of issues that we would be having to face no matter who is in charge in Washington or Beijing. I think it's important to point that out.
All right. There's a lot to talk about, at least for that specific dialogue, gentlemen. I hope that the four of you and many of you will come to my program as frequently as possible to have the real views shared and insights discussed. That's at least what we can do together. Thank you so much for the four of you for joining us. Zhang Junshe, Zhao Tong, Robert Ross, Robert Daly, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, the four of you, for being with us.